about needles and organization, but I also did have a couple of questions for Kalika and Mrs. Thiele, if
Okay,
that's
please
okay.
go ahead.
Questions or comments. So, Kalika, you mentioned saris and their history, and
Mhm.
that's so interesting. For example, the sari I'm wearing is one I wore at my wedding, right? And it's 30 years old now.
Mhm.
And, I'm hoping, and it's the silk kanjivaram. I don't know if that,
Mhm. Mhm.
means anything to anyone else, but it's made out of silk fabric and it's a very traditional
Mhm.
sari from where I come from. And maybe it's much like, I'm not sure what the custom is in the United States, but I'm hoping I can pass it on to my daughters, but I'm not sure that it will last. So that was beautiful. I wanted to ask you about your 21 saris. How
Mhm.
did you decide which ones to pick? Uh, because, as you said, there's so many. How did you decide which ones to showcase?
Very, very good question, Sowmya. First of all, when I'm writing a book, there is a physical limitation how much a book can contain, right? And so that was my first criteria. Like, hey, the book is a coffee table. It cannot be, it cannot be like a encyclopedia. Somebody should be able to hold it and read it. That's one. Even though I've documented 85 saris using stories on my blog, I had to go to the size that can be first put it in the book. That was my first criteria, the physical limit of the sari. Then each sari, so how did I come to the 21 number? Each sari has a one-page story, 2 pages of photos, and 1 page of what features and history it has. So each sari would take 4 pages. So I can go up, if I'm trying to make 100 pages book, I can go up to a certain number, right? And how did I come to like not 25, why 21, right? So I listed down all the saris that are uh, there by their state, and then each state, at least one prominent sari has to be in the book. Like, for example, you are wearing a Kanjivaram. It's from Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu has so many saris, but Kanjivaram is one of the most known from that region. And in some cases, I explicitly chose a very unknown sari from that region, because then it also tells people something new to learn from. So that's kind of how I went about. Like, India has 29 states and 5 union territories. And not every state, like some states do not have it, and it has to stand on its own uniqueness. So if I'm writing something Gara sari, like just heard Mrs. Thiele talk about embroidery, and it's Gara is purely nothing but embroidery, and but it talks a huge about Persian influence and Parsi culture that is so ingrained into Indian society that I cannot not do that sari, for example. So that's kind of how I came to choosing saris. So it has to be, once each state has to have one sari that is in the book, that the state is famous for saris. If some states do not have saris as in their primary area. Like, for example, I think Mizoram or Himachal Pradesh do not have a sari. They do have a fabric and weaving, but not a known sari. So that is how I feel. From that 25 being my maximum limit, I came to 21. Also, I think in Indian culture, there's something to do with the odd numbers. I don't know what it is. So that was another factor that played into why 21, why not 20 or 22 kind of thing. So that's how I decided. Thank you for asking that question.
Sure, thanks. That makes a lot of sense, actually. And it is hard to. You don't want a super thick coffee book either. And Mrs. Thiele, I was wondering, you've been sewing for a long time, right? With embroidery and just general sewing. Um, I believe that was the only class I failed at in my school days. I'm hopeless at it. But I was wondering, this is a question, if there are any places in Champaign-Urbana where adults can learn sewing on a machine. Would you know of any such places? I think you're muted.
Mrs. Steely, you're muted.
Sorry. Sorry about that. I forgot to mute.
That's okay.
Lincoln Square used to have a fabric store there that had lessons. And there is another Bernina shop. You'd have to look it up online to see where it's at. They give lessons. Haven't been in there too often. They keep I think Joanne's Fabrics does some.
Oh,
And I think Michael's also does some, but there's not a lot of it. And there's some sewing clubs around that, quilting clubs especially, that help people sew if they want to.
yes, because as you mentioned, it's not as maybe in the school curriculum, or people don't sew as much anymore at home because of the ready-made fabrics being available, possibly. I would remember a time when we bought fabrics all the time exclusively.
Well, you can buy a pair. It won't last as long, but you can buy, especially if kids are growing, that's not a problem of keeping it. But yeah, you can buy things ready-made cheaper than you can make them a lot of times. And trying to think.
Okay.
And I would have to look. Since COVID, there've been a lot of changes and people have moved around, and so I haven't been out and around enough to know, but I do know Joanne's and Michael's and the Bernina shop do have sewing classes.
Thank you.
And I think in Muhammad, there is a quilt shop that also does. Can't remember. I think it's called the Quilt Shop, but I'm not sure.
I had a question for Mrs. Steely. I think, in general, I've seen embroidery, quilt, knitting being very, very natural way of choosing artwork on a fabric. How did you, what fascinated you to choose embroidery over knitting versus any other things? I'm just curious because I personally love embroidery and over knitting, but I wanted to hear your journey into how you decided to go into the embroidery.
Well, embroidery, I started doing that probably when I was 4 years old. And they say if you start doing your pants, and it was something the family did. And it's just something that there's lots of things that you can do, and it's easy it keeps little fingers busy sometimes. And boys like to do it too. My son sews too. My brother sew.
Do you find it very healing?
What?
Do you find it healing when you do
Healing.
that?
Therapy.
It can be frustrating. It can be. The thing that I've done, I'm not one, I come from a big family, so you're always doing things. So you can do knitting, you can do counted cross stitch and watch TV or listen to the radio or something else. You don't have to just set, you can be creating something while you're listening and learning something else. And I don't know, I got the machine, and I did do machine embroidery before they had the computerized ones. And I find that more challenging and almost kind of more satisfying because you actually are moving around and moving the fabric around as the sewing machine is stitching, rather than just sitting there and watching it. But sometimes it's faster to do a design or that's already presented, but you can also put your own designs in and digitize them and have them printed out. But it's changing. It's changed a lot since I started sewing with my grandma's machine and my mom's machine. They had to put a buttonhole attachment on it it didn't zigzag. So
All right,
Chongwei mentioned, sorry, Kuldeepa.
go ahead.
Chongwei mentioned healing, and I remember if people, again, people from India will remember Madura coats. They made threads in India, an embroidery thread. And so I bought one of these like pre-designed cross stitch, you know, it was a house by a lake. And I remember the Christmas after my PhD qualifier exams, that's what I did. I did the cross stitch, and it was very healing, I think very blood pressure lowering for me. And then, unfortunately, I don't know what happened to it, because after that, you know, I had to hit the ground running with my dissertation, and I never saw it again, and I have no idea where it is now. But I just remembered it when you mentioned healing, Chongwei.